There's a fighting game that's been on my radar for a while now, and this past winter, I finally got around to buying it. The game is called Fantasy Strike, and I remember I first saw this game at PAX East in 2017. I remember thinking that the game looked great, but I really had no idea what the game was about, other than it was a fighting game. Fantasy Strike was published and developed by Sirlin Games and was released on Switch, PS4, and PC on July 25th, 2019. And just if you're curious, as of December 11th, 2019, the game supports crossplay across all of those systems. Sirlin Games is headed by David Sirlin, who's responsible for balancing the video games Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix. He's made a few board games since then, and in particular the games Puzzle Strike and Yomi. They feature characters from Fantasy Strike. They were featured before Fantasy Strike was a video game, so the characters in Fantasy Strike are based off of the characters from the board games he created. Fantasy Strike is a fighting game that's marketed as being super accessible and great for people just getting into fighting games. While this is true, it shouldn't also undermine its surprisingly complex fighting mechanics, and the fighting mechanics in this game concentrate on a big aspect of what makes fighting games so great, and that's the reading of what your opponent is going to do next and how you can punish it. The complexity and depth in this game isn't about getting the right inputs on the controller to perform a special move, it's knowing when and how to use those moves. Fantasy Strike is a great fighting game and should not be overlooked by fans of the genre. Fantasy Strike normally goes for $30, but I ended up picking it up for $20 during the Steam Winter Sale. The $30 asking price, I will say, is pretty reasonable. So after I bought this game, I kinda got slightly addicted to it. This game reinvigorated my love for fighting games. After I bought this, I ended up buying Samurai Showdown 5 and Street Fighter 5, just because I was craving some more fighting games. So the last fighting video game that I really got into was BlazBlue. But the problem with BlazBlue is that after they released the second one in the series, BlazBlue Continuum Shift, they started to release yearly updates, or at least it seemed like they were yearly updates, of just new characters and new balance changes for $50. And there's no cheaper way to upgrade if you owned the game already. I just couldn't keep up with it. And then a couple years later with Street Fighter V's release, it was kind of the same thing, but just on a per character basis. So I hadn't really gotten into a fighting video game for a long time until now. Now I'm like all about them. And it's all due to Fantasy Strike. If you're interested in the game even a little bit, it should be at least on your wish list. What Fantasy Strike does so good is it breaks down the concept of a fighting game into its core components, reading the enemy's movements and capitalizing on their mistake. See, in Fantasy Strike, what makes the game less difficult than other games is that special moves aren't done by quarter circles or charging in one direction. Special moves are completed by a push of a button. So for instance, a character like Grave, he can shoot out a cloud projectile by pressing the special button, which is triangle on the PS4 controller. While shooting, you can hold left, right, or neutral on the D-pad to adjust the speed of the projectile. Or you could also hold down the button for a slower but larger projectile, and that can punish incoming jumping attacks. This does not make the game less complex. All it does is make it so special move inputs can be completed by anyone. The challenge now is knowing when to do these moves, and this requires you to read your opponent and punish accordingly, in addition to getting competent with your character. And these are all components of great fighting games. The game uses a 3-button system, A, B, and C. A is square on a PS4 controller, which are your standard attacks. You can press this in combination with the directional buttons to adjust the attack. B and C are your special moves, triangle and circle. They're unique for each character and they can change depending on a button press or whether or not you're in the air or not. If you press A and B together, that performs a throw, and then B and C, they do your super. And each character has 2 supers, one in the air and one on the ground. Each of the 10 characters in this game look and play so differently from each other. For example, Geiger.
Max Geiger is a watchmaker, scientist, and logical thinker.
His shtick is that he can control time, but he is this game's version of a charge character. He has a special move where he can launch a projectile, sort of like a Sonic Boom from Street Fighter. But since there's no charge moves in this game, he has a meter at the bottom of the screen instead. And this meter is in the shape of a cog, and it fills up as long as he's not moving forward. When the cog fills up completely, he can shoot his projectile, or do his other move, which is a flash kick looking move, which is invulnerable for the first few frames, and this is indicated by Geiger flashing white. This is a mechanic of the game. You can also hold the button down to delay the release of your projectile instead. Compare him to someone like DeGray, who's probably my favorite character in the game. DeGray has a ghost that he can use during combat using the C button. This ghost is named Desdemona, and yes, there's a story behind her, and it's kind of awesome. DeGray can command Desdemona to grab an opponent, which stuns them for a bit if it connects, which is enough time to land a quick 2-hit combo or some mix-up shenanigans. The Gray also has another passive ability where if he lands certain attacks as a counter hit, they can hit for additional damage. His 1-air super can do 3 hits if landed right. The game also has a great tutorial system. And when the game starts up, there's an interactive tutorial that you can replay whenever you want. But in addition to that, each character has their own spotlight video. And these are like YouTube-style videos that explain each character's strengths, weaknesses, and combos. It makes learning a new character pretty easy, at least to get the basics down. The game has a decent set of features for single-player and multiplayer. Online-wise, there's ranked and casual matches. And as I said before, the game now has crossplay between the Switch, PC, and PS4. The game's single-player options are pretty good too. There's arcade mode, and this gives us some backstory for each character, and this is told through dialogue and artwork, a lot like the old Street Fighters. Honestly, this really helps expand on the characters' personalities and motivations, and some of it is well thought out, to Gray especially. The brief story told about his past and the ghost Desdemona makes me want to hear more about his story. Or how the character Setsuki, she trained under Graves' guidance, which is why they both have the same forward attack, the double palm. The stories are all pretty good for the most part, and is definitely part of what gives this game its charm, at least for me. Other single-player modes include survival mode, and this pits you against a set number of increasingly difficult enemies, and a boss rush mode. And boss rush mode is pretty cool, because before each match, you can select one of 3 possible upgrades to your character, almost like RPG mechanics, and they can greatly alter the core gameplay, like the ability to shoot a short-ranged attack every time you do a back attack, or increase the speed of a certain move, or just increase your health. It's really fun, but not good if you're trying to practice before playing online. One unique feature that this game has going for it is its health bar. Now normally in fighting games you have a continuous health bar that decreases depending on the strength of each attack. In Fantasy Strike, your health bar is split up into discrete segments, and attacks chip away at each segment. Most basic attacks decrease your health bar by 1 for each attack landed, but there's some supers and even some regular moves that can decrease your health bar by 2 or 3. Specials and supers also have block damage. If you block an attack 3 times, then you'll lose 1 segment. Another interesting mechanic are the throw reversals, which are called Yomi counters. In order to reverse a throw, you need to press nothing. Yes, you need to just stand there and press nothing if you anticipate a throw. If you're successful, then when an opponent tries to throw you, you'll perform a Yomi counter, and you'll actually attack the other player instead of just canceling the throw. Pulling one off is sort of difficult, as it's not instinctual to just press nothing, and if you're wrong, you're just going to set yourself up to be attacked. But pulling one off is super satisfying. I'm a really big fan of the graphic style of the game. The game is presented with a lot of bright colors and almost reminds me of playing a cartoon. I know that might not be for everyone, but I think the animation and graphics all look top notch, and fit the theme of the game very well. I also like how each character is designed. He reminds me of the Ghost of Christmas Present.
From Muppet?
Yeah. There are 10 total characters in this game, and this isn't the first time these characters have been used. These characters in Fantasy Strike are actually from other board games created by David Sirlin. They appeared in board games like Puzzle Strike and Yomi. Puzzle Strike in particular is pretty interesting. It's basically a deck building game where you attack other players by sending blocks onto their board. If the opponent ends their turn with 10 or more blocks on their board, they're out of the game. It plays pretty much in the same vein as Super Puzzle Fighter, a puzzle video game. It's funny because Super Puzzle Fighter itself is a puzzle game based off of Street Fighter, a fighting video game.
Goes fighting game, fighting game.
Well, fighting game, puzzle video game, puzzle board game, fighting video game. Yes, with this game we have come full circle. Another game that features these characters is a card game called Yomi. Yomi is a card-based fighting game where you can dodge, block, attack, and throw your opponent using slightly more complex rock, paper, scissors mechanic. The thing is, you don't know what your opponent is going to draw, so you have to read what your opponent will play next and respond accordingly. In fact, the word Yomi means reading in Japanese, like reading your opponent. Honestly, I just started playing this game a couple weeks ago, and I'm finding it extremely satisfying. Now, these aren't the only games that feature the Fantasy Strike characters, but they're the only ones I played outside of Fantasy Strike itself. Both Puzzle Strike and Yomi are available as board games that you can purchase, but they're also available on Steam and iOS as well. What's interesting about these games is that they have the characters from Fantasy Strike, but they also include 10 additional more, so for a total of 20. And I really hope that they plan on implementing these additional 10 characters into Fantasy Strike to increase the roster. So Fantasy Strike is a game that really needs some more traction. This is a solid fighting game here, and all the hype about accessibility and being a great introduction to fighting games is great, but it should not make veterans of the genre ignore this game outright. Yeah, it's definitely less complex than most other fighting games, but the game is deep, a ton of fun to play, and a great example of easy to learn but hard to master gameplay. I can't stress enough that the streamlined special moves being inputted by button press over a quarter circle or whatever does not sacrifice any depth the game has. If you're even remotely interested in Fantasy Strike, I suggest you give it a shot, because it really is the best fighting game no one is playing. I would also highly recommend the card game Yomi, which is equally as fun, and it's a fantastic representation of a fighting game using card game mechanics. So that's why I think Fantasy Strike is the best fighting game that no one is playing right now. Thanks a lot for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.
Three different things. Melon! He has different ways he says the word melon. Here's a melon! Melon!